Keanu sat under the hot studio lights, hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while Winona tried to hide her nerves behind a small, practiced smile. Across from them, Jimmy Fallon leaned forward with that familiar, playful curiosity, completely unaware that one unexpected question was about to drag a buried promise back into the light. The cameras were rolling, the skyline backdrop shimmered behind them, and the audience hummed with soft laughter from the last joke. On the surface, it was just another late-night interview, 3 people in suits, a microphone, and the safe distance of show business charm. But inside, Keanu's chest felt heavy, as if every breath had to push through 10 years of unsaid words. He wasn't afraid of the cameras. He was afraid of the moment his eyes might meet Winona's and finally admit, without a single word, that he remembered everything. Winona shifted a little closer to him on the couch, the way she always did when she felt exposed. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, a casual touch to anyone watching, but to him it was a quiet reminder of the night that had changed both of their lives. Years before, far from any spotlight, in a tiny hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. She wondered if he still carried that memory the way she did, like a secret scar that hurt in the rain. She kept her smile bright for the audience, yet her mind was somewhere else, replaying flashing ambulance lights and the sound of his voice telling her, "You're not alone. I'm staying." It had all started with a phone call no one was ever supposed to hear about. She had been in the middle of a film shoot when she collapsed, numb from the pressure, from the headlines tearing at her reputation, from the constant whisper that she was difficult, broken, over. The studio wanted to keep it quiet. Her team wanted to spin it. But Keanu just showed up. No cameras, no publicist. Just an old friend who sat on the cold floor outside the operating room, refusing the private lounge they offered, holding a paper cup of bad coffee like it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. Nurses had recognized him, of course, but he gently shook his head each time someone reached for their phone. "Not tonight," he would say, soft but firm. "Please, not tonight." The tabloids would later call it a mysterious health scare, a passing headline in a week full of gossip. No one reported that he had held Winona's trembling hand when she woke up, that he quietly paid for the extra night she needed in the hospital when insurance tried to push her out, or that he stayed until sunrise, listening while she cried about feeling like a burden, on the industry, on her friends, on herself. He never tried to fix it with empty affirmations. He just stayed, present and patient, until her breathing finally settled. Years later, sitting on that glossy talk show couch, she still remembered the way he had looked at her back then, not like a troubled actress or a fading star, but like a person who was allowed to break without being thrown away. That memory lived behind every easy laugh they shared in public, behind every inside joke fans adored. It was why, even tonight under the blinding studio lights, she kept glancing at him, measuring his posture, his eyes, the tight line of his jaw. Something in him was different, tenser, as if he knew this interview wouldn't stay in the shallow end for long. Jimmy shuffled his note cards, eyes flickering between them and the pair sitting across from him. The crowd quieted, sensing, though they couldn't have known why, that the air had shifted. A producer off camera flashed a subtle signal, time for the viral moment. The segment they'd planned would be light, a funny anecdote about mispronounced wedding vows in a movie they'd done together. It was supposed to be harmless, the kind of story that made for easy clickbait the next morning. But Jimmy, known for his spontaneity, suddenly set the cards aside and leaned in with a grin that held just a bit too much curiosity. "So," he said, drawing the word out as the audience leaned forward, "I heard there's more to the story between you two than just on-screen chemistry. I mean, come on. Keanu, Winona, everyone's always wondering, what's really going on there?" He chuckled, tossing it out like a joke, but his eyes were searching, waiting for something real to slip through the cracks of their media-trained smiles. Winona felt her stomach knot. She knew the harmless rumor he was fishing for, the playful, fan-favorite idea that maybe, just maybe, they were secretly married from that old movie, that their bond was somehow written in the lines they'd spoken on camera. It was cute. It was safe. But beneath that rumor lived the truth. There had been a night after the hospital when she had almost told him she needed him for more than his kindness. And there had been a moment when he had almost answered with something other than steady, selfless silence. Now, with millions watching, the question landed between them like a live wire. Jimmy turned directly to Keanu, his smile widening. "Keanu, what's the deal with Winona?" he asked, his tone teasing, but his words hitting a place they were never meant to reach. "Is there something you're not telling us?" The crowd laughed and cheered, already expecting a clever punchline. Keanu opened his mouth to speak. And then he didn't. Keanu's lips parted, but no sound came out. For a split second, the studio lights seemed too bright, the applause sign too loud, the room too small. He could feel Winona's eyes on him, the way you feel a hand hovering just above your skin without touching it. The safe answer was right there on his tongue. A laugh, a shrug, a joke about being movie married. Yet something in his chest tightened and refused to let it out. His silence stretched just long enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Winona's smile flickered almost imperceptibly, and she rushed in to bridge the gap. We've just known each other forever," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "He's like my accidental husband." The audience laughed, some of them clapping at the reference to the film they all knew. The tension eased for them, but not for her. She knew Keanu well enough to recognize that look, the distant focus in his eyes, the way he swallowed twice before blinking, as if fighting down a memory that didn't belong on a comedy show. She thought of that first night in the hospital again, of the way he'd stared at the floor before whispering, "You matter, Winona," even when the world forgets to say it. Jimmy chuckled, riding the wave of audience reaction, but he hadn't missed Keanu's hesitation either. "Accidental husband?" he repeated, leaning toward her. "Come on, there's gotta be more to that story." His tone was still playful, but there was a sharper curiosity there now, the instinct of a host who could feel when something unscripted was hiding beneath the surface. The control room loved moments like this, when guests teetered on the edge of something real. The camera operator zoomed in a fraction closer on Keanu's face, catching every tiny shift in his expression. Keanu finally forced a small smile when he wanted to diffuse a situation without lying. "We did a movie once where a real priest did the ceremony," he said slowly, voice calm but quieter than usual. "So, maybe we accidentally made it official." The audience roared. Someone in the back shouted, "Tell her you love her," and laughter rippled through the room. On the surface, it was the perfect, charming answer. But there was no teasing glance toward Winona, no playful nudge. Just that faint, haunted softness around his eyes that only people who had broken quietly knew how to recognize. What no one in the audience knew was that the last time the two of them had talked about that accidental wedding, it hadn't been funny at all. It had been late, long after another press junket, the two of them sitting on the edge of a hotel balcony, legs swinging over the side, the city glittering beneath them like a field of distant cameras. Winona had been exhausted of the jokes, of the headlines, of the way people turned their connection into something shallow and consumable. "Sometimes I wish it were real," she had blurted out, half laughing, half choking on the confession. "Not for the romance, just for the safety of it. The idea that there's one person who doesn't leave." Keanu had gone quiet then too, looking out at the skyline. "If it were real," he'd said, "I'd spend my whole life making sure you never felt like you were too much." The words were soft, almost lost to the wind, but she had heard them. She had carried them. And then they had both fallen silent, because going further than that would mean naming something that might destroy the fragile peace they had found. Two scarred people leaning on each other without demanding more than the other could give. Now, in the glaring brightness of Jimmy's studio, those unsaid words felt dangerously close to the surface. Winona shifted again, tucking her foot under her leg, anchoring herself. She decided in that instant to protect him the way he had always protected her. "He's being modest," she told Jimmy, glancing at Keanu with a small, knowing warmth. "He's probably the kindest person I've ever met, and he hates when people point that out." She let out a soft laugh, inviting the audience to join in. They did easily, but Jimmy's interest had sharpened. "Kindest person? That's a strong statement," Jimmy said, eyes flicking between them. "What's he done? Give us something. We love this guy." The crowd whooped in agreement, some chanting Keanu's name. It would have been so easy to keep it light, to tell the story about him giving up his seat on the plane or the meme-worthy tales fans already knew. But Winona hesitated. Her mind flashed back to the night she'd woken up in that hospital, throat raw, chest aching, and found him sleeping in a plastic chair, head tilted at an impossible angle, still in the same clothes from set. She opened her mouth, the memory pushing against years of secrecy. "There was a time when I was really not okay," she began, her voice softer now, the studio growing quieter with it. And everyone around me was trying to manage the situation, spin it, hide it. He was the only one who didn't treat me like a problem to solve. She swallowed, eyes dropping briefly to her hands. He just stayed, for hours, all night actually. A murmur ran through the audience, but it wasn't the usual giddy excitement. It was a different kind of attention, the kind that leaned in, recognizing pain when it finally dared to show its face. Jimmy sat back, surprise flickering over his features. This wasn't the light-hearted anecdote he'd been fishing for. "All night," he repeated quietly. "Where were you?" His question hung there, gentle but direct. Winona glanced at Keanu as if asking for permission to go further. He gave her a tiny nod, almost imperceptible, but to her it felt like a hand reaching out in the dark. She drew a breath, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "In a hospital," she said, "because I broke, not physically exactly, just everything at once." There it was, laid bare in front of millions, the thing her team had begged her to keep vague, the wound the world had once mocked her for. She could almost hear their voices in her head now, warning her, "Don't go there, don't give them more ammunition, don't let them see how fragile you were." But another voice rose to meet that fear, the voice that had whispered in that corridor years ago, "You're not alone." "I'm staying." Silence fell over the audience, the kind that feels like a collective held breath. Jimmy's face softened. The crew behind the cameras went still. For a second, even the city lights in the backdrop seemed quieter. Winona could feel her heart pounding in her throat, but she kept going because suddenly this wasn't about gossip or chemistry anymore. It was about telling the truth of what kindness had looked like when everything else had gone wrong. "And while everyone was arguing outside my room about contracts and headlines," she continued, voice trembling just slightly, "he sat there, on the floor. He didn't say, 'Be strong.' He didn't say, 'You'll get through this.' He just asked, 'Do you want me to stay?' And when I said yes, he did." She blinked back, the sting in her eyes, a small, disbelieving smile tugging at her lips. "That's the kind of person he is." The crowd erupted into applause, but it wasn't wild or chaotic. It was deep, steady, full of something like respect. Jimmy looked at Keanu, genuinely moved, caught off guard by the weight of the story he'd accidentally pulled into the open. Keanu shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, but he didn't deflect it with a joke this time. He just dipped his head slightly, as if accepting it not for himself, but for the idea that showing up quietly for someone might actually matter. As the applause faded, Jimmy leaned in again, slower now, more careful. "Keanu," he said, his voice losing its late-night bravado, "why didn't people know about this? Why keep something like that a secret?" It was a fair question, perhaps even a necessary one. The cameras waited, red lights blazing, capturing every line of his face. The whole world, it seemed, was ready to hear him finally speak his side of the story. Keanu inhaled, the question cutting closer to a place he rarely, if ever, opened on television. His eyes drifted for a moment, just a heartbeat, back to that corridor, to the echo of his footsteps, to the familiar ache of his own losses that had driven him to stay by her side. He felt Winona's presence next to him like a steady warmth, an anchor against a tide he'd spent years keeping at bay. He turned back to Jimmy, ready to answer. And just as he parted his lips, the floor manager began frantically circling a finger in the air, signaling the one thing that could slice through the moment like a blade. They were out of time, and they had to cut to commercial. The applause sign flashed again, but this time it felt almost violent, ripping through the fragile honesty hanging in the air. A cheerful jingle swelled from the speakers, and Jimmy's expression shifted in an instant, host mode snapping back into place. "We'll be right back," he said, turning to the camera with practiced brightness. "More with Keanu and Winona after the break. Don't go anywhere." The audience clapped on cue, but their eyes were still on Keanu, waiting for the answer that never came. The moment the red lights on the cameras clicked off, the room transformed. The easy warmth of the show dissolved into a low murmur of crew voices, the shuffle of stagehands moving props, the rustle of audience members stretching in their seats. Jimmy leaned back, exhaling sharply as if he'd been holding his own breath. "Man," he muttered under his breath, glancing at them both, "that got real." For once, his tone wasn't joking. There was a flicker of regret in his eyes, regret for pushing, for not realizing how deep the question would cut. Keanu blinked, the spell broken, his answer still lodged somewhere in his chest. The interruption felt like a mercy and a theft at the same time. On one hand, he was grateful not to have to unwrap old grief on live television. On the other, he knew that silence, especially when televised, could easily be turned into something it was. People would fill in the gaps with whatever story they wanted. That was the danger of staying quiet in a world that made money off your mysteries. Winona studied him in the sudden half-dark of the studio, stage lights dimmed while they reset. Up close, without the soft glow of the cameras, he looked tired. Not in the way a long day makes you tired, but in the way that carrying things alone for too long does. She scooted a little closer, their shoulders almost touching now. "You okay?" she asked quietly, barely moving her lips. The question was gentle, not demanding, the same way he had once asked her in that humming hospital room. He hesitated, then nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly, though his voice didn't sound convinced. "Just not used to talking about that stuff." His eyes drifted toward the audience, still buzzing with half-whispered speculation. A few people were already pulling out their phones, typing furiously, no doubt priming the internet for a dozen think pieces about the look he'd given her, or the moment he hesitated. He knew how this game worked. And he also knew that behind every trending clip, there was a real person whose private wounds became public entertainment. Jimmy leaned toward them, lowering his voice so it wouldn't carry too far. "Listen," he said, sincerity edging out his usual showman charm. "I didn't mean to blindside you. I thought it was a harmless question. If you want, we can steer away from all that when we come back." He looked particularly at Keanu, almost apologetic. It was rare to see him this unguarded, stripped of his monologue energy. For a moment, the host and the guest were just three people in a room, trying to navigate the cost of being honest under fluorescent lights. Keanu met his eyes and gave a small, understanding smile. "It's okay," he said. "You were just doing your job." He meant it. There was no anger in him, only a quiet acceptance of how these things worked. But something else had been stirred up inside him, something Jimmy couldn't see. When Winona had spoken about that night, about breaking and being treated like a problem, it had pulled him straight back into his own memories. Nights in silent hospital rooms, holding hands that would never squeeze back, sitting vigil because there was nothing else left to do. What he hadn't told anyone, not the talk shows, not the interviews, not even most of his friends, was that the reason he had stayed with Winona that night wasn't because he was some saintly protector. It was because he recognized in her eyes the exact same emptiness he'd once seen in the mirror. The same heaviness that whispered, "You're too much trouble. You're easier to love when you're a story instead of a person." Staying wasn't an act of heroism. It was an act of recognition. "Maybe," Winona said suddenly, turning to both men, "we don't have to run from it." Her voice was tentative but firm, the way someone sounds when they're tired of hiding. "People always talk about us like a meme or a ship or a joke. But what if someone out there needs to hear that this industry doesn't get to decide when you're worth staying for?" She lifted her gaze toward the darkened crowd, the faint outlines of faces watching them even during the break. "I know I did, back then." There was a beat of silence as her words sank in. A floor manager, headset on, paused mid-stride and glanced at her, surprised. The control booth, visible through the glass at the back of the studio, suddenly buzzed with more activity. A producer lifted a phone to her ear, speaking quickly, clearly rethinking the segment order. The vulnerability that had almost been cut off by a commercial break was now too potent to ignore. Jimmy looked between them, something shifting behind his eyes. His whole career had been built on joy, on making people laugh at the end of long days. But he wasn't blind to the fact that the world outside his studio had become heavier, lonelier. Maybe what people needed tonight wasn't another goofy game or staged confession. Maybe they needed to see that even the faces they'd plastered on posters and memes had sat in hospital hallways, wondering if they were worth the trouble. "We've got about a minute," the floor manager called out. "Back in one." The studio lights began to warm up again, bathing everyone in a familiar golden glow. Makeup artists rushed over for quick touch-ups, dabbing at the corners of Winona's eyes, patting away the slight shine on Keanu's forehead. They both sat still, letting it happen, but inside something had already changed. The mask was slipping, and for once, neither of them felt like racing to put it back on. Keanu stared at the microphone on the desk, its silver grill catching the light. It struck him that for years he had used his silence like armor, polite, gentle, unassuming, but armor nonetheless. He believed deeply in humility, in not centering himself, in doing good quietly and walking away. Yet watching Winona share her pain so openly, and realizing how many people might be listening who felt just as broken. A question pressed into him. Was staying quiet still an act of humility, Or was it becoming a way to hide from the responsibility of what his story could mean to others? He thought of the fan letters he never answered but always read in private. The ones from people who had lost too much, who found comfort just knowing someone they admired had survived the unimaginable and kept going with kindness intact. He had never wanted to be their savior, never wanted them to lean on him like a crutch. But tonight, the line between privacy and purpose felt thinner than ever. 10 seconds, someone called. The applause sign lit up again, and the audience began to clap, this time with a strange mixture of excitement and reverence. They knew they were in the middle of something different, something that didn't feel like a manufactured moment for social media. Jimmy straightened his tie, shot them both a quiet, supportive nod, and turned back toward the camera as it blinked red once more. "We're back with Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "And we were talking about something pretty real before the break." He looked to Keanu, then to Winona, as if handing them not just the conversation, but the choice of where to steer it. The usual structure of the show, bit, joke, plug, suddenly felt flimsy, almost irrelevant. Keanu felt his pulse pick up again, the question still waiting from before the commercial like a page he'd never turned. Why keep something like that a secret? He let his gaze travel over the audience, seeing not a crowd, but individuals. Some smiling, some thoughtful, some with that particular stillness he recognized too well. People who had lost parents, children, partners. People who had sat in emergency rooms at 3 in the morning, begging the universe for one more day. People who had convinced themselves they were a burden because that's what life had taught them. He looked at Winona beside him, at the quiet courage it had taken for her to speak her pain out loud while the world watched. He knew that courage. He also knew how much it cost. Jimmy gently repeated the question, this time without any trace of performance. "Keanu, why didn't you want people to know?" His voice didn't push, it invited. Keanu drew in a breath, feeling the old instinct rise, to deflect, to downplay, to change the subject. But underneath it, something else rose too. A different kind of courage, quieter and older, the kind that says, if this hurts me but helps someone else feel less alone, maybe it's worth it. He exhaled slowly and finally spoke. "Because," he began, his voice low but clear enough for every microphone to catch, "I never wanted her pain to become a story." The audience went utterly still. He paused, searching for the right words, knowing that once he set them free, there was no taking them back. "And the thing is," he continued, the faintest tremor in his tone, "that wasn't the only time I sat in a hospital hallway." "I've been in those hallways before," Keanu said, eyes fixed on some point beyond the cameras. "With people I loved who didn't get to walk back out. And when that happens, you start to understand something. The hardest moments of someone's life are not for public consumption. They're not content. They're not trivia." The studio was so quiet they could hear the faint hum of the lights. Winona listened, her breath caught halfway in her chest. She knew some of his story, pieces of it, but not like this, not handed gently to a room full of strangers. "I stayed with her," he went on, nodding toward Winona, "because I knew what it felt like to think no one would, and I didn't talk about it because I didn't want it to be about me being a good guy." He gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "I just wanted it to be about her getting through the night." Jimmy's eyes shone, his usual jokes forgotten. "But you see what it means to people," he said quietly. "What you both just shared, that's going to help someone out there who thinks they're alone in that hallway." Keanu let those words sit. He glanced at Winona, and for a moment they were back on that hospital floor. No cameras, no audience, just two people holding on. She gave him a tiny nod, the kind that said, "I'm here." The kind that answered the question he had asked her years ago, "Do you want me to stay?" With an unspoken, "I stayed too." "So if we're going to talk about it," Keanu said, turning back to the crowd, "then I want to say this: if you're the one in that bed or the one on that chair outside the door, you're not a burden. You are not too much. Someone staying for you is not a favor. It's what love looks like when it's doing its job." A soft, stunned murmur moved through the audience, followed by applause that rose slowly, not loud but deep. Some people were wiping their eyes. One woman near the front clutched the hand of the person beside her like she just remembered why it mattered that they were there. Winona took a breath, voice unsteady but clear. "And if you've messed up," she added, If you've fallen apart in front of the whole world, you still deserve that kind of love. I used to think kindness had to be earned. She tilted her head toward Keanu, reminded me it's something we give each other because we're human, because we all break. The applause grew, filling the studio. It wasn't the wild cheer of a punchline landing. It was gratitude, recognition, relief. Jimmy didn't try to talk over it. He simply placed a hand over his heart and nodded, his own throat tight. When the sound finally tapered off, Jimmy leaned toward his guests. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting us with that, for trusting them." He gestured to the cameras, to the invisible millions beyond. "This is going to mean a lot to people." The segment wrapped. There were still jokes, promotions, the usual late-night rhythm. But the energy was different now, grounded by what had been said. When the show ended and the crowd began to file out, some audience members lingered near the edge of the stage, not for autographs, but just to say thank you with their eyes. Backstage, away from the lights, Keanu and Winona walked side by side down a quiet corridor. The echo of their footsteps took them both back for an instant, to hospital tiles, to sleepless nights, to the moment their friendship had been forged in the shadow of fear. Winona broke the silence first. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't have to share that. You could have kept it all locked up like you always do." He smiled, a little weary but lighter than before. "Yeah," he replied, "but maybe keeping everything inside wasn't as humble as I thought. Maybe it was just safe." He glanced at her. "And maybe tonight wasn't supposed to be safe." She considered that, then slipped her arm through his, casual and warm. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you stayed back then and tonight." They reached the stage door. Beyond it, the dark street, the waiting cars, the internet already buzzing with a headline it didn't fully understand. Jimmy Fallon asked about Winona Ryder Keanu Reeves. Silence said everything. People would replay the clip, dissect the pause, write essays about his quietness and her courage. But the real story wasn't in the silence. It was in what finally broke through it. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the city humming around them, Keanu looked up at the sky, a soft, endless dark scattered with light. He had lost a lot in his life. He had sat in too many hallways. He had learned to carry grief like a second heartbeat. Yet tonight, watching Winona stand in her own truth, letting his own guard fall just enough to reach someone beyond the cameras, he felt something unexpected. Not exposed, not used, but useful. Kindness, he realized, wasn't just about staying in the quiet shadows. Sometimes it meant stepping into the light, scars and all, and saying, "I've been there. You can survive this. You are worth staying for." He turned to Winona, and they shared a small, private smile, the kind you only share with someone who has seen you at your most breakable and stayed anyway. Without another word, they walked forward together into the night, two people who had once met in a hallway of almost endings, now choosing again and again to stay.